Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob here with my co-host, as usual, Stan. And Stan, you know what? Today is going to be a very, very exciting day for you, talking about a couple of your most favorite topics. It will be absolutely out of this universe, is all I have to say.
Indeed, Rob. It's going to be out of this universe, and it's converging two of my favorite topics, cybersecurity and space. We have the privilege of welcoming Tim Fowler, and Tim is an accomplished offensive security analyst and penetration tester. He works for Black Hills Information Security, but he doesn't only do that. He also is taking advantage of his research capability and interest in space to see how cybersecurity can be applied in space systems, and has written and teaches a course on the introduction of cybersecurity in space systems. So I think it's a great topic for us to cover in the podcast. And Tim, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so let's dive into the world of space systems and cybersecurity. And I think would help if we establish a foundation, if you explained, what really encompasses a space system, and specifically, what are those key segments or subsystems and how they interact in a broader architecture of some kind of space operation.
Yeah, absolutely. So space systems are typically comprised of three primary segments. There would be the ground segment, and that's going to be all of your terrestrial-based operations, your network control center, just, all of everything that we do here on the ground as far as managing the mission from design all the way to operation in space. And then we have the space segment, which is the most obvious to understand. It's the part in space. And this is typically going to be one or more satellites, maybe a constellation of satellites or something like that. But it's just literally the elements that are in space. The third segment is the user segment. And this is one that we're very familiar with, but we don't really think about it for a whole lot. But that would be just the end users of whatever the service or the mission of that space system is really provided. So like you could be GPS on your phone is a great example of that. Is you operating in the user segment of that space system. And in between those, we do have the link segments, which are typically RF communications that allow us to be able to send commands to the spacecraft, be able to control it, as well as receive the telemetry back from it so that we know what the kind of status of the spacecraft is. But then also in the user segment, for us just to be able to interact with the data that's being provided to us, such as GPS.
And in my background, Tim, I supported, as a security engineer, a ground station for an Air Force platform. And to your point, I mean, you really had this world separated in these different pieces and parts. So we were focused on the security of the ground station and the communications, but there was a whole nother team that was dealing with the actual platform side of the house.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's historically the way it's been. We've had a lot of, I don't want to necessarily say security to obscurity, but there's been this hyper isolation in these segments and stuff where, you're only concerned with your objective, and everything else is somebody else's responsibility. And we will oftentimes see that kind of interoperability. That's where some things can get interesting, especially from a security perspective. And so, yeah, your experience is exactly what I would expect.
Imagine, right?
Well, good. And thank you for that breakdown as well. It's very helpful, I think, for the audience. Now, let's go into that a little bit further, Tim. So you consider the uniqueness of the environment for space in general, right? How does the design of the space systems themselves differ from the terrestrial systems you were just discussing as an example, relative to cybersecurity, right? But also extend that a little bit, right? Let's kind of try to connect the dots for the audience. Are you seeing similarities of that kind of thinking and processes from a cyber perspective with space systems, somewhat tied into how we deal with kind of the OT or the operational technology environments today? Are there any similarities you see there as well?
Yeah. So we'll first kind of compare it to what we know. And that's what I always tell people is like, start with what you know and work from there, and try to see if you can apply this knowledge laterally to see if it does. Fundamentally, when it comes down to an architecture, I would say it's about 95% analogous to what we see in our terrestrial environments and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That last 5%, though, is very, very complicated. And it is very unique because it's due to the constraints in the environment that you have to operate within space. You can't just hey, let's call a technician, go tell them turn it off and on again. It doesn't really work in the context of space and stuff. But from a fundamental architecture standpoint, they're very, very much the same. And I would think they're even getting more and more in line with each other, especially as we see migrations to cloud-based infrastructure especially for ground control, mission control systems and stuff like that. The things that we're doing over here for your Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company in terms of securing that infrastructure and architecting it, it's really going to be the same that we're going to see on the space side. As far as you're, comparing it to like operational technology and the application of cybersecurity there, OT and like ICS and stuff like that, it's really gone through a kind of a renaissance in terms of a security perspective over the last 20 years or so. It used to be the thing that's like, we just don't talk about it. We all know that there's like some skeletons in the closet, but we're isolated. We don't really have to worry about it. But as we got more interconnected systems and networks and requirements, and it's like some, developers like, oh, we have this doodad that can do this new thing. Let's just plug it up into the internet and it'll be great. People have started to acknowledge like, hey, we got to do a better job of making sure that we're assessing this from a cybersecurity perspective. That is starting to happen in space. It's not to the level or to the point that like OT and ICS is. We're probably 15 years behind or so, if I'm being completely honest. But that's one of the reasons why I think this kind of topic is so important, is we can take the lessons that we've learned from things like the OT and ICS space and apply them to the space segment or into space systems, because it is very much the same technology. It's kind of the same control paradigms and things that we have to take in consideration, especially when it comes to like critical infrastructure.
But Tim, some practical challenges I would imagine with applying some of the typical cybersecurity controls we do in terrestrial systems might be challenging when you're trying to apply it to space systems. An example that comes to mind is encryption. Can you speak to that as to why that sometimes is a challenge for communications?
Absolutely. So one of the first like biggest assumptions that I had when I started researching into space systems is I was like, well, I'm like, it's 2020 something. Everything's encrypted, or the majority of things are encrypted in space. And the answer to that is just unequivocally no. And it was a little surprising because I put on my cybersecurity hat and going like, okay, let's think about why this might not be the case. And it's like the first thing I kind of thought about is going back to my olden days of being a pen tester and working with clients and stuff, is like just the computational overhead of encrypting. It's like, it's just too resource constraint. We really can't afford the loss in bandwidth and stuff like that. And that is a factor, but it gets way more primal than even that. And it's, operating in space, we don't have the advantage of the atmosphere or much atmosphere to protect against ionizing radiation. And that's a real massive threat to a space system.
So you just flip a bit and you
just flip a bit,
your whole communications, right?
Yep. One solar storm or coronal mass ejection or something like that can create havoc within the electronics of your spacecraft. If you happen to flip a bit in your encryption system where your key is stored, how do you handle that? Hopefully you've accounted for that scenario. And there are radiation resistance or components that you're going to use in space systems and stuff like that. But even they're only fault tolerant to a certain degree. And so we have to engineer our systems and develop our systems a way that they can be fault tolerant, be able to exist in these harsh environments and go, hey, it's not a matter of if a bit flip's going to happen. It's a matter of when a bit flip will happen. How are we going to be resilient and stuff? But that's why one of the reasons we don't see encryption used across the board. You'll see it hopefully on super sensitive systems,
military systems, right?
Military systems go, and you'll see a good example of where you're not necessarily going to see encryption, and because there's no point, would be like the NOAA weather satellites for the weather imagery stuff. The mission doesn't dictate it. It would be unnecessary, and it would actually go against its particular use case and its mission objective. And so you wouldn't. But the command and control uplink to those satellites and stuff, you better believe those need to be encrypted, because the last thing you want is for one of your systems to be compromised and lose control of it.
Yeah, taken over. Right.
Yeah. Well, let's double click a little bit more on that, Tim. So I mean, it's the diverse systems involved, right? Within the cyber kind of aspects that you have to take into account. When you think about these things from kind of the strategies you want to implement with cybersecurity at the core behind it, what are some of those kind of defense measures, control mechanisms that you're putting in place, but how are you also going about selecting them? Maybe an example would be around like threat modeling, and what role is that playing in, the shaping of protocols, right, within that space system?
Yeah. So the answer really, it starts fundamentally at the design stage. And when one of the challenges that we have in space is the people that are working in space, and they are some of the absolute brightest people on the face of the planet. They are intelligent. They think in ways that just will absolutely blow your mind. But they are hyper focused in their one area of expertise, their knowledge and experience. And that with that comes that hyper focus really does create tunnel vision, and where it leaves some gaps that vulnerabilities and stuff could exist and stuff.
They're functional requirements, right?
They're functional requirements.
I am building a telescope, and I am looking at the optics, and I am not thinking about somebody trying to misuse or abuse my wonderful telescope.
I just need it to work the way it's supposed to. And that, like, the functional requirements for space are a challenge in of itself. So the first thing is we have to do as cybersecurity professionals, we have to understand the mission. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't understand the mission, if we don't understand what the inputs and the outputs are of this space system, we will fail at helping these organizations secure that mission and those assets and stuff. Because what we're going to say is, oh, you have to use encryption. Cool. But we don't understand what the constraint is. We don't understand that, hey, maybe our mission actually doesn't require encryption in our user segment stuff, but obviously we want to in our control mechanisms and stuff. Like, we need to understand that. We need to understand what the fault tolerances of things are before we just start going, hey, you have to do this. And a lot of it is going to come down to, as you mentioned, like your threat modeling and stuff. The threat modeling for space is definitely unique compared to like terrestrial environments and stuff, because we have the space factor. We have all of those environmental things that thermal cycling. If you're talking about a satellite in low Earth orbit, orbiting, approximately once every 93 minutes, it's going to experience upwards of 200 degrees Celsius in temperature delta every 46 and a half minutes. You have to design around your electrical components to be able to withstand those temperature variations and stuff. And so, we can't just be like, oh, you've got to do this arbitrary cybersecurity thing on the microcontroller that's managing your thermal control system as well, without fundamentally understanding what is it doing, how is it doing, and where the actual potential issues lie. And so for applying cybersecurity in space systems, we have to start at the very beginning. It is very difficult, near impossible, to bolt this on after the fact, because all of those resources that were available, they've been accounted for. Every megahertz of processor, every bit and byte of RAM, it's not just, oh, let's go patch the system. If we didn't design it to be patched, it will not be patched.
So Tim, here's a challenge I see. I mean, the lead time between that design phase, actually the conception phase, all the way through to actual implementation of getting the platform, launched and the ground station operational, could be years and years. And the threat landscape, as you well know, as a pen tester, as an offensive kind of on your day job, you know how quickly things change as far as how attacks can evolve. Anticipating what kind of attacks could be, your platform, your deployment could be subject to, is, I imagine, quite a challenge to be able to early on figure that out, and then be able to realize that, okay, what I'm deploying now is going to be safe against some of these attacks. Have you seen real world examples of this?
We've definitely seen cyber attacks in space systems, not necessarily clearly in the, taking advantage of the time frames. I mean, James Webb Space Telescope is a great example. It took us 10 years to build that.
Right.
And so just the amount of technology and capability that transpired during that window, when a design decision was made in 2012, but it wasn't deployed until 2022, like that, there's a big gap in that. And so, a lot of it comes down to just nailing the fundamentals, is because we're never going to future-proof ourselves entirely from the unknown. It's, I could turn this back around and go, it's like, well, how are you going to defend against the tomorrow's attack that you've never seen? We don't know. Like, we have to put things in places that it's not so much against being able to defend against the attack. It's about being able to respond accordingly.
Sure. But can you give me some examples though? Just you mentioned that there have been some successful attacks against space-based systems. Can you share with our listeners some of those that have occurred?
The most recent and kind of it's the case study that's going to be moving forward was the ViaSat or KA-SAT network hack that took place in February of 2022 on the eve of the Ukrainian invasion. This was a very unique attack in that it came in from it involved two different segments. It involved the ground segment being compromised, as well as the user segment and user terminals being able to effectively interact with systems on the ground side to be able to manipulate the traffic. And effectively what happened was approximately 45,000 or so satellite modem terminals went dark on the eve of this Ukrainian invasion. And the result of this, it wasn't an actual compromise of the satellite itself, but it was, like I said, it was a two-prong attack. They, on the ground station side, they came in through the internet, through a VPN portal where credentials had been accessed. They were valid credentials, would allow them to authenticate. And then from there, they were able to kind of move around within the environment until they found a TFTP server that was the modems were reaching out to be able to upload firmware and stuff. They put a modified firmware that essentially was a wiper, and it wiped the firmware on all of these modems and things like that. The user segment was a little more complex. They were taking advantage of some things of the way the DHCP configuration and environment was set up within the environment to essentially kind of deny terminals from being able to connect to the network. And so we had a little bit of a user segment denial of service, as well as the ground segment compromise over the internet.
Got it.
Interesting. So Tim, I want to try to kind of transition to a different aspect as I was thinking about the conversation we're having here. And are you seeing anything relative to kind of regulation coming into play, right? There's a lot of international, I'm sure, crossover and collaboration that takes place, but just kind of what's happening out there through the collaboration side, but also tied into, are you seeing any sort of kind of, standards being applied from at least maybe domestically or other contributing countries as well?
So generally to operate in space, it does require some level of international cooperation and things. Because you've got, you can't own space. Like it's not like, all right, we're pitching our tent. Although the United States did plant a flag, on the moon,
right,
but we don't own the moon. But so like even things like that to specific orbits in which your satellite, like those, it's cooperative efforts to make sure that, hey, we're not in an orbit that's going to cause issues with another spacecraft. The last thing we want is to have a collision or anything like that. But there are also kind of regulatory and standard bodies. One of them, the kind of the most common one is a group called CCSDS, which is the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems. And they have put out, you can kind of think of it like if you remember back in the day, the DoD, the Rainbow books.
Yeah.
Rainbow series, yeah.
Yeah, Rainbow series. They basically have their own Rainbow series. They've green, blue, magenta, yellow, and stuff like that. But these are standards and recommendations, as well as some things that are coming, not pre-recommendations, but kind of future technology stuff for helping standardize how space systems are designed and communicate from a data perspective, things, and utilizing those standards are definitely helpful. One of the things that it helps us do, like with most standards, is it keeps it like if I'm working for company A, well, and I go work for company B, that's also space, like I'm not having to relearn how things are being done and stuff. It helps from that standpoint. But then there's also they're addressing security. There's a lot of publications even from NIST about how to better secure the individual segments and things like that. So we are seeing there's a ton of international collaboration that's going on. The problem that we really have is that there are just different tiers of operating in space because of it's gotten so cheap, it's gotten so cost effective with the democratization of space. The fact that for $150,000 or whatever, which is, cheap relative space, I can go launch my own satellite. Well, I don't really have to adhere to like all these international standards other than, making sure I'm in compliance with my frequencies and I buy the licensing and stuff like that. But it's like, I can kind of just do what I want to do as long as I'm not disrupting anybody else's stuff like that. Whereas when you look at the larger kind of ecosystems, like constellations, like SpaceX would be a good example. They're wanting to put 42,000 Starlink satellites
Yeah, it's
up in
outrageous
orbit.
how many platforms are putting up. Yeah.
Yeah, you need to have that kind of cooperation and making sure that you're, interoperability and just, building that, maintaining that you're not going to disrupt services or anything like that from other people. So yeah, there are regulatory stuff. I think it's ultimately, I maintain that GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, is the only levers that are really going to move the ball forward. Until things become requirements that we do it the right way, it's probably not going to be done, because it is a challenge. And it's like, space is already hard enough. Let's just bolt on something even more difficult in some cases. And so we are seeing that, but it's a slow kind of process like anything else. It's going to be very organic.
Tim, when we talk about like DevSecOps and a successful transition to DevSecOps, and we talk about the culture and the fact that you have a culture that has security awareness and the developers are enabled and have that awareness about how security can impact ultimately the posture of their application, right? You've talked about the challenge of, again, the engineers are very focused on the functional requirements. You have the different segments and the focus on each area, and you also shared though that there's a lot of awareness documentation out there to help with cybersecurity. How is this, as far as building that awareness and the culture of that cybersecurity is something that has to be considered early on in the life cycle, again, design phase optimally. How is that progressing, and in your interactions with folks, and you're trying to change that by teaching a class on this topic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
To some degree, you're trying, even though you're not necessarily an expert in space engineering, you're taking your expertise of cybersecurity and trying to inject that into your interest in space to be able to try to move that needle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not going as well as I would like it, but that's always going to be the case. Like, we always want it to be better and better and better, but it is, more and more people are starting to understand that this is not optional anymore. We're getting out of the phase and the generation of the security through obscurity. Nobody has the resources, nobody has the technology to be able to mess with our stuff, sans nation state threat, stuff like that. But like, the Joe Schmo, they're not going to be able to do this stuff. Well, we've seen technology revolution with things like software defined radios and stuff, where it's like, that's not the case anymore. So more and more companies are taking notice that it's like, hey, we actually do need to be we need to be more proactive. We need to really, make our software developers specifically more aware of what these things are, because at the end of the day, the vulnerabilities that are going to be existing in a space system are predominantly going to be software. If you look at the historical issues, one of my favorite examples is the Phobos 1 mission from the USSR. It's a Mars probe that, through a series of unfortunate events, if you will, they were forced to launch with a test procedure still active on the onboard computer. The only way they could remove that is to actually physically swap the computer out prior to launch, and they got a no-go on that. So they launched this probe with this test sequence in it, but nobody would ever issue the command sequence to enact it. So they're like, it's safe. Well, turns out August 28th, 1988, I believe, a satellite operator issued a command that had a trailing hyphen on it. Well, that hyphen would have been detected by their kind of sanitization system that checked all of their commands and things, but it wasn't working that day. So the operator bypassed it, sent the command anyway, and through the processing of this single hyphen, ultimately triggered the test function, which shut down the attitude determination control system and effectively ended the mission. And so like this was, in the late 80s, and we still see issues like that and stuff, but it's looking at I had the misfortune of writing a vulnerable piece of a virtual satellite last year, and it was humbling because my code did exactly what I wanted it to do. Like it solved its purpose. It's functionally perfect, if we will.
Met the requirements.
It met the requirements. It was efficient, but it wasn't secure. And I was about 2:30 in the morning. I woke up, realized, oh, there's a remote code execution vulnerability in that.
Ooh.
And sure enough, I got up the next morning, tested it out. Nice little encoded who am I command, and the satellite returns root. Oh, that's a rough day. But these things happen. Like,
right.
I work in cybersecurity, and I made that mistake. But why? Because I was hyper focused. I was trying to accomplish this one little thing. And so as we move into a more DevSecOps and our kind of mentality, especially with cloud and things like that, we have to make sure that we're taking into account cybersecurity at every single step of the way, whether it's through static and dynamic source code analysis, those type of tools, but regression testing, all of your standard methodologies become even much more important, especially as we try to speed up the timeline to get to space with anything.
Right.
It used to be years and, a decade, and now it's sometimes as short as, and that's a short amount of time to really be able to look at all the potential issues.
Yeah, it's truly a race to your point. You gave a great example just now. Just think it through from this perspective. What do you see as the most concerning emerging threats? And what are the areas of challenge that, the field really needs to be getting best prepared for to take into account?
So as far as the biggest emerging threats, there's a couple. The biggest one for me is just the fact that we still have a reliance on aging space systems. Some things have been up there for 30 plus years, and they're still serving their function stuff.
Yeah.
The technical debt and the fact, like, we're stuck. Like, we can't, the only option is to replace it, because there is nothing else that we can do with that. But also just the technology capability that we have in non-space systems for being able to emulate or interact with space systems. We see it with GPS jamming and spoofing, and you're even seeing it in, like, with the flight. So what is the ADBS or whatever? That's definitely a concern. But the biggest kind of threat, in my opinion, is just our reliance on satellite infrastructure in ways that we don't think about it in our daily lives, but we are so dependent on that that if we don't get a grasp of it, if we don't do a better job of making sure that we're doing kind of as much as possible a security first design, and I'm not going to be naive, security first in space just fundamentally doesn't work, because it's going to be about trade-offs and compromises and stuff. But if we try to have a security first mindset when battling the constraints of space and stuff, we're going to do better. But if we don't, especially with anybody and everybody being able to go and just, launch something up into orbit and do what they want to and stuff like that, it's only going to get worse if we don't kind of pump the brakes and go, nope, we need to make sure we're doing this the right way. And there's a lot of technologies that are coming, there's one of the coolest things is software-defined satellites. We all know about, like, software-defined networking and software-defined radio, but now imagine just a commercial off-the-shelf bus that you can buy that you literally just load up your satellite software and stuff. Now, that brings in an interesting supply chain attack vector and things like that. If you've got this common hardware bus and stuff, and that's another big concern as we get to more and more people entering into space. Less and less people are actually developing their own platforms. They're just going and buying a platform.
That supply chain.
Supply chain is definitely a legitimate concern. Probably more so as you get into the higher sophistications of the missions and stuff like that. But even down to CubeSat platforms and low Earth orbit and stuff, where these platforms are commoditized and stuff. A vulnerability in one is a vulnerability in all, and that's definitely a problem.
Hey, Tim, one last question for you. The class that you're teaching can you talk a little about that as far as where it's available? Is it online that people can possibly take? We can actually include a link at the bottom of the show description if you'd like.
So the class is called Introduction to Cybersecurity and Space Systems. I've produced it in partnership with Anti-Siphon Training. You can find it on the course information on anti-siphontraining.com, and it will be hopefully sometime late Q3 2024, where it will be available on demand as well. So the current iteration is live, but virtually live. And then I do have a special edition that's going to be taught at Wild West Hacking Fest in South Dakota in October. It's the same content, but instead of utilizing virtual hardware, we're actually going to use physical hardware and simulated CubeSats to actually be able to teach the class, which I think is just going to be absolutely amazing.
Well, Tim, I mean, with this show, Reimagining Cyber, we always try to focus on coming in with different approaches and different thought processes relative to cybersecurity. You've truly taken us into a new frontier in covering this topic. No pun intended.
Maybe the final.
But let's be careful, right?
That's copyright. That's copyright. Careful.
I just said maybe the final. The final what? I don't know.
Right. That's right. You didn't finish
what you perceived. Yeah, that's on yourself.
That's right. You. But truly appreciate you coming on, and I think the audience is really going to enjoy this episode, especially because it truly is something that we've not discussed in the past. I think you've shined a light on things people weren't even considering. Your examples of something like just that we take for granted with GPS systems and what potential impacts could be there, right? So a lot of great information. Truly appreciate you coming and joining us today.
My pleasure. It's been a blast.
Hello, producer Ben here, and you heard Tim tell Rob and Stan that one of the biggest threats to cybersecurity in space is the reliance on aging systems and how some satellites have been in orbit for over 30 years. Now, it's not the first time this kind of issue has been raised on Reimagining Cyber. Go and have a listen to episode 60. It's called Energy and Cybersecurity, and it features Ginger Wright. She's Energy Cybersecurity Portfolio Manager for the Idaho National Laboratory's Cybercore division within its National and Homeland Security Directorate.
In the energy infrastructure, we have devices that are in regular use today that are decades old. And so when I think about in the IT world, I have Patch Tuesday, where every week my critical infrastructure is updated. And then after about 3 years, I toss it and I get another one that is completely and wholly built on the more modern incarnation of technology. When we think about operational technology applications, energy or water, we certainly can't re-engineer those systems on that cycle of replacement. So often we may not be able to patch, or the technology that we are using is so old that the vendor has now no longer supporting patches. And so there is no patch to be done. What's important in these environments is often then using sensing technologies to start to understand where anomalies are happening and where you can then link those anomalies to a pattern of indicators that say there must be an adversary at work here because things don't naturally fail in these patterns.
That was Ginger Wright, Energy Cybersecurity Portfolio Manager for the Idaho National Laboratory's Cybercore division. And finally, a quick request. If you listen via Apple Podcasts, do give the show a rating and a review. It'll help spread the word to other cybersecurity enthusiasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.